Great, thanks very much. And thanks everyone for coming. It's really nice to see you all here. So what we thought we'd do is talk a bit. I'll talk a little bit about the bigger project of which this is a part. Rebecca's going to talk a bit about scrapbooking, and then we'll talk about the two sections of the book that we each curated. There's four sections in all, and at the end we'll just say a little bit more about the two other sections that part of the book. And yeah, so that's the structure. So this project as a whole was called Queer Beyond London, and it came out of a conversation that Alison Oram and I had about sort of 10 years ago, where Alison's a leading lesbian historian, and we just realised the extent to which London dominated the queer history in Britain, to the extent that London's queer history was almost standing in for a national history, and that realisation also that what was happening elsewhere wasn't a poor imitation of what was happening in London, but was distinct, and there was a series of very distinct stories and histories to tell. And that realization was in part kind of came through the kind of wealth of community history, LGBT history, that followed the changes to Heritage Lottery Fund protocols in the early 2000s, which meant there was this kind of upsurge of community history projects across the country. And we chose four cities where there was a particularly rich set of community history projects going on, and Manchester was one of them, Leeds, Plymouth, and Brighton. So we had two cities on the south coast, and two cities in the north. And what we found was that local geographies, the local economy, work patterns, distance from London, cultural histories, all these things kind of shaped ideas of identity and community in really quite particular ways. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. So Manchester, which you know well, we realised how important it was. The various people in oral histories talked about the radical past. So from the Pankhursts, from Peterloo through the Pankhursts, through the labour movement, union movement, and how important this was to the stories that queer Mancunians were telling us, and were sharing with other community history projects. But we also saw how important the union movement was, the kind of the impact of deindustrialization and those post-industrial spaces, the importance of a progressive city council from the 1980s, and also the impact of especially aggressive policing from 1959 when there was a new police commissioner. And all these things, I think, fostered a queer culture in Manchester that had a particularly radical edge. So we were kind of attuned here to a kind of particular set of ideas around queer identity and community. And we found what was happening in, for example, Plymouth and Brighton, what was happening there was really quite different. So, for example, in Plymouth, the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, which partially decriminalised sex between men, really was a bit of an irrelevance. Partly because Plymouth was a naval city, and being lesbian or gay in the armed forces was illegal until 2000. So what we found in Plymouth was actually a really vibrant queer scene, but which was consistently below the proverbial radar. If you went without knowing where to go, you'd think nothing was happening. In Brighton, on the other hand, the 1967 Act was a bit of an irrelevance because people were already behaving there as if what they were doing was legal. And there was already a strong culture of visibility that was associated, I think, with a proximity to London, with a strong arts scene, with the new university, and this geography that was very compacted. So counterculture had a much bigger impact on the town than it did in these more spread out contexts. And so when Clause 28 came along, which this is the Clause 28 protest in Manchester, the biggest in the country in 1988, when Clause 28 came about, this was a real affront in Brighton. And there was a real upsurge of activism in Brighton around 1988. In Plymouth, it was an irrelevance because people didn't want to be visible in the first place. So there was just one poster in a bookshop window in Plymouth. That was the extent of the protest there. But in short, we found that locality really mattered to the way in which people understood themselves and each other, and the way in which they formed networks and communities. And that was the case even across a period from the 1960s to the present, in which we tend to think about Britain becoming more culturally homogenous, but we still found that locality really mattered. And so as a result, you got a kind of real difference in the texture to pride, for example, in each of these places. So in Manchester, we found this kind of fusion of civic pride, a pride in being Mancunian, and a pride in the city being fused with a gay pride. In Plymouth, there was a pride in passing. And in Brighton, there was a real pride in a kind of individualism and visibility. So we got this kind of different textures in different places. But this was only 4 cities. And so for the second book, should we knit that? So for the second book, we cast our net wider. This was the second book in the project, which I edited with Alison Oram again and with Justin Bengry, who was the first lecturer in queer history at Goldsmiths College and established the master's program there. And what we did here is we looked at other places. You can kind of get a sense of that book here. But we also looked internationally. So one of the things we were interested in was the way in which kind of international currents were negotiated or inflected in local contexts. So you can see here, you've got the Himalayas in Yorkshire. You've got Florence, the English colony in Florence, and so on. So the ways in which ideas of locality come into conversation with international networks and so on. So this was the second book. But still, what we realized is that we still weren't really doing justice to the kind of wealth of material that we'd kind of found through these projects. And so we thought that there was really scope for a third book that showcased some of the archival material that we'd thrown up, but also that we'd come across in various community history projects that were going on across the country. And so that's where the idea of a scrapbook came from. And the team that worked on that was me again, and Justin, but also Rebecca and EJ Scott, who's a trans museologist. And the idea of scrapbooking kind of has a long queer history, which Rebecca's gonna talk about.
Thanks, Matt. So as Matt said, we particularly liked the idea of producing a queer scrapbook, because scrapbooking is something which has been really important in queer and trans history for at least the last kind of century. So I just wanted to kind of talk you through a couple of examples of queer and trans scrapbooks over that period, just to give you a sense of the different ways in which scrapbooks have been important in building our kind of community history. This one is one of my favorite examples. It's actually an Australian lesbian. So I lived in Australia for a while and worked in Australian lesbian history. And so this was actually the first queer scrapbook that I ever got my hands on. And it's just an amazing example of the ways in which scrapbooks can work for individuals in constructing a sense of queer identity. Monty Punchin was just a phenomenal character for a start. She was born in 1882, lived till 1989, so over a century, and came out in the 1980s, so in her kind of late 90s, early hundreds. But obviously she'd had, an incredibly long period of her life in which she was forming relationships with other women, but not able to claim a kind of open lesbian identity because it wasn't something that was current in her kind of early adulthood. So she produced these scrapbooks between the 1920s and the 1950s. And yeah, as I said, they're just an amazing illustration of the ways in which scrapbooks can help individuals, particularly in a period when there was no kind of public LGBTQ identity to claim, to help them to construct some kind of sense of queer self. So if you can see there on these couple of page spreads that I put up there, she's got a kind of eclectic mix of women in masculine dress, women with cropped hair, There's lots of stuff on adventurous and sporty women. She was particularly keen on aviators and drivers, who in the kind of interwar period were really kind of at the radical edge of what women could do. There's also examples of women couples that she found in newspapers and so on. And slightly randomly, cuttings on Australian Japanese relations, because she was really interested in that topic too. So kind of unique to her. But yeah, you can see the way she's kind of putting together this idea of a sort of a physical aesthetic with a sensibility that relates to sexuality as well. My next example, which is a little bit dark, I'm sorry, is from Urania, which was a British journal that was produced again in the early 20th century between 1915 and 1940. It was produced by a small group of feminist men and women, and their byline for their journal was "Sex is an accident." It's a really fascinating publication, which is very ahead of its time in the way in which they were thinking about gender. So they wanted to ignore a sort of binary model of gender, and instead they were advocating independence for women and what they called sweetness for men. They saw gender as a social masquerade. So their journal was essentially a kind of giant scrapbook. It was all sort of typed up and looked quite professional, but what they did was pull extracts from publications, newspapers, books, other journals that they had come across that were on the theme of gender, and particularly this idea that sex is an accident. But the real heyday of LGBTQ scrapbooking is in the 60s and 70s. So in the 60s, LGBT media is really beginning to take off. We've got the sort of formation of what we call homophile groups, so kind of social or campaigning groups, who were trying to educate the wider public about the fact that that lesbians and gay men and trans people were not as terrifying as people might think that they were. And some of these groups, the Minorities Research Group, which was the first lesbian organization, Homosexual Law Reform Society, produced their own magazines. And so these magazines were incredibly important for building community in a period when still most people did not want to be known to the people around them to be gay or trans. But what they could do was kind of identify other people around the country who were also living kind of fairly isolated lives, but were able to kind of come together in these magazines. So they have kind of fascinating letters pages and so on, where people are writing in and sharing their stories with other readers. But the other thing that they have is often they would have kind of pages of that were essentially set out like scrapbooks. So people would send in newspaper clippings from their local newspaper, or little kind of historical pieces that they had come across on people who they thought were lesbian or gay in the past. And it was a really important way of building community, so helping people to feel that they were connected with other people around the country. So this one up on the screen here is from the Beaumont Bulletin, which was the publication of the Beaumont Society, which is Britain's first trans group. And it was published from 1966 onwards. And you can just see the kind of cutouts from different publications that they had reproduced there. And another trans publication that was read in the UK in the 60s is TV Clip Sheet, which was produced by an American group called Full Personality Expression. And they had a kind of main publication called Transvestia, which was sent out to readers in Britain and across the US and elsewhere in the world. But TV Clip Sheet was specifically a scrapbooking publication. So all the clippings that people from around the world sent in got put into TV Clip Sheet and shared with the mailing list. So you can see there's a couple of British newspapers up there mixed in with the US ones. The thing I particularly love about TV Clip Sheet is that, and Beaumont Bulletin did it as well, they cut out cartoons and pictures from the mainstream press, but they got rid of the caption and recaptioned them on a theme that was a kind of trans theme. So it's a really nice example of how people were kind of critiquing the sort of dominant narratives about gender and putting a new voice to it. So inspired by this tradition of scrapbooking, we approached our own scrapbook in a similar way. So when we were thinking about what material we wanted to go into the book, we essentially crowdsourced it. So we sent out requests to archives, asking them to choose items from their collections that they particularly liked. As Matt said, we got in touch with some of the many community history projects that have sprung up as a result of the Heritage Lottery funding, which has just been an incredible flourishing of local LGBT history in the last decade or so. And a lot of those groups have also produced a wealth of oral history material. So there's a lot of kind of excerpts from oral history in the book as well. We also asked historians, academic historians, public historians to send us kind of little pieces on particular sources or local histories that they were interested in. And we drew on our own experience as well. So as Matt mentioned, E.J. Scott is a trans museologist. He's the founder of the Museum of Transology. So had amazing wealth of knowledge about the kinds of materials that we could draw on for that. And yeah, so we all kind of chipped in with our specific knowledge as well to fill in any gaps. So the book is basically a mix of images, cartoons, oral histories, newspapers, also some slightly longer commentaries by individuals who kind of wrote up slightly longer pieces. So like scrapbooks, it's quite an eclectic mix. It is certainly not comprehensive, but what we hope that we've done is to showcase some of the kind of diversity of British and Irish LGBTIQ experience, and also to give a sense of the kind of variety of sources that we can draw on to tell the kinds of histories that we're interested in. So Matt is now going to talk a little bit about his section that he curated.
Thanks, Rebecca. So yeah, so we had 4 sections. So Rebecca curated the section on home and family. Justin, the section on sex and socializing. I did the section on art and culture. And EJ did the section on activism and politics. And we each started with I mean, the first thing to say is that I think the designers at MUP did this amazing job of actually really making it look scrapbooky. So, these bits of sticky tape and Post-its and so on. We're really pleased with the way it's come out visually. And we each started with an introduction and in each case kind of putting ourselves, I suppose, in the story a little bit. And so this bit is about me growing up definitively outside London in a village in Staffordshire, which was definitely not a queer mecca in any sense at all. And in fact, there was very few kind of reference points. And so what I really remember as a kind of 15, 16, 17-year-old is seeing the film Maurice, Prick Up Your Ears, the film about Joe Orton, and sort of, in a way, connecting a kind of culture or a set of histories, if you like, to my emerging sense of self and identity, and realizing just how important arts and culture were to kind of queer cultures and identities and resistance and so on. And that these were ways of kind of expressing difference. It was a way of forming community and connection. It was a way also of touching imagined pasts, because of course one of the issues with queer history is that what we're dealing with mostly is silence. So this idea that the homosexual is most himself when he's not visible, because he had to and she had to render themselves invisible. So you're often dealing with retreating shadows. And so the arts and culture, the arts have been really important in kind of imaginatively filling and addressing some of those gaps, and also imagining better futures. So this was what I was trying to do in this section, was just give a flavour of the kind of rich theme of queer arts across Britain in this period. Again, as Rebecca said, very eclectic, definitely not comprehensive. And what I did, and I should say, I co-curated this section with my daughter, Jaya Rathbone. So she's up there in the author biog as well. And we looked at different genres, so at film, at theatre, at art, and arts and crafts. And this was one of three spreads on film. And I wanted to highlight this one because in the top left-hand corner, there's the film Victim, which some of you may know. It was a 1961 film with the heartthrob movie star Dirk Bogarde. A really brave film for him to do. And what's really interesting about it, it's really depressing. I mean, it's about blackmail, suicide, but it was produced after the 1957 release of the Wolfenden Committee report, which was recommending the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality. And films like this were, in a way, a kind of tacit bit of propaganda or protest or kind of making the case, I suppose, for reform, which came in 1967. So these arguments were often getting made through literature, through film, as much as they were getting made through direct pressure groups from the Campaign for Homosexual Equality and so on. And then underneath that, I found a bit of oral history from a guy called Michael in Plymouth. And he went to see the film in Plymouth in this cinema, the ABC. And so he describes going to see this film as a 17-year-old and how the impact it had on his life. In that he realised, he associated, what was happening there with his own emerging sense of self, realising the kind of urgency of a politics, which he became involved in later. But he also describes how he was on his own in the cinema. There was nobody else there. It was just him watching this film. And he also tells the story of how after the film, he went up to the projection box and had sex with the guy that was projecting the movie. So there's this real sense of the cinema as a place to watch films, but also maybe have some fun as well for Michael. And he said he used to do the circuit of the three cinemas in Plymouth and have quite a lot of fun with. But what emerged through wider research as well is that sense of the cinema being almost like home in a period that could be really difficult. So I interviewed this wonderful old guy called Rex, who lived in Camden in the 1950s in a bedsit, and he was having a pretty tough time with visits from the police and so on. And he describes going to the cinema as like a kind of retreat, of like going home. You could go and just immerse yourself in whatever film was showing. And so the importance of particular films, but also the importance of cinema as a place to retreat to. And theatre could work in a similar way as well, as we'll see. But the other thing just on the right-hand side is that cinema really then became really important mode of cultural expression. So one of the things that's happened in fairly rapidly in cities across the UK is mini film seasons, lesbian and gay film seasons, and so on. The BFI Flair festival's on at the moment, and so what you've got there is a series of different extracts about different film festivals across the country. Okay, should we go on to the next? So here's one of the spreads we did on theatre and performance, and this is on Gay Sweatshop, which was one of the the main gay lesbian theatre group formed in the early 70s, initially jointly, and then like many gay lesbian groups split in I think 74, 75. But what I've got on the left-hand side there is the tour, is one of their national tours, and you can really see they go literally all over the country, all over Ireland. I remember seeing Gay Sweatshop in the late 80s in Sheffield. So they became a real kind of focal point for many people as they toured the country. And they're one of their key. Actually, the play that I saw in Sheffield was The Dear Love of Comrades, which was a historical drama about Edward Carpenter, the romantic socialist, who lived just outside Sheffield with his working class lover in the in the Edwardian period and after. And that's there's a little review there from Peace News, which we wanted to include because it kind of signals the kind of countercultural allyship that you had in this period. So different countercultural movements advertising and reviewing each other's work and so on. But the reception wasn't always so positive. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got Blood Green, which was a gay sweatshop play about transgenderism, as they called it, and it got reviewed in the bottom left-hand corner. It got reviewed by the Cork Examiner, which said that it was an enigma that was totally forgettable. So not quite such a positive review. And in fact, one of the things we tried to do across the scrapbook is include some of the kind of vitriol and homophobia that queer lives have had to navigate. Partly because we had quite a conversation about this. You know, on the one hand, we didn't want to kind of foreground some of the kind of really pretty disturbing homophobia that we were coming across in some of this material. But on the other hand, it felt important to include because it was what a lot of people were reacting against. And certainly the kind of arts and culture movement, it was one of the ways of kind of pushing back against some of this homophobic rhetoric. Yeah. Idroma Montgomery wrote this lovely piece about a jazz musician who was born called Lillian Jemmett, who was born in the docks of Cardiff in the early 20th century, and learnt there to become a singer, and became pretty well known. She toured Europe, she played in Amsterdam, and ended up playing clubs in London, including the infamous Gateways Club, which was a lesbian club, in Chelsea, from before the war years through to the 1950s. A really key figure and really interesting way in which he found that singing, that jazz, the music scene was a general sense of bohemianism, was a way to kind of navigate queerness. You know, without actually ever saying that she was a lesbian, she was able to kind of find a way to be in the world, to find a livable life through the music scene, but also found ways to reinvent herself. So she, in later interviews, she claimed that she was from Harlem rather than from Cardiff, because I think she thought it had a richer kind of queer pedigree than the docks in Cardiff. But okay, so this is the section, a couple of spreads on art. On the left-hand side, you've got Edie Craig, portrayed here by her partner Tony Atwood, and there was a third woman that lived with them in a throuple in Small Hythe in Kent. Tony Atwood was an artist. All three of them were very interested in the theatre. They had a theatre built in the barn with various performances and so on. And it was a really nice example, I think, of how this trio managed to kind of create a life for themselves through art, and through, again, a kind of bohemia in Kent. And you get a kind of updated version of that with Ian Massey, who talks about how important art school was for him in the 70s, and then how St Ives in Cornwall became a really important place to kind of anchor him and anchor his queerness in the later period. So he talks a lot about Barbara Hepworth, the sculptor, but also just about kind of leaving home and going to art school and how revelatory that was in terms of the ability to express yourself in different ways and so on. So yeah. And then there was this idea of art as more direct protest. So this is in reaction, this is arts and crafting in response to Section 28, the Lesbian Knits series from Leeds. So there's some knitting patterns, there's some examples of the knitwear that came out of that. But this I really love on the right-hand side. There was a lot of badge making, and there was a badge making collective called Intentional Promotions. So if you remember the wording of Clause 28, it forbade the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities in schools, museums, libraries, archives, and so on. And so this group in Leeds went about intentionally promoting lesbian through their badge making workshops and crafting and so on. Okay, I think that's great.
Yeah.
So over to home and family. Yeah.
Okay, so I curated the section on home and family. Um, what I was, well, it felt really important to include a section on home and family in this book because they're themes that often get left out of LGBTQ histories. We've tended, I think, in the past to kind of focus on histories of activism, histories of kind of social spaces in the public sphere and so on. But of course, home and family are equally important to LGBTQ people. So what I was trying to do with this section was both to kind of foreground those themes, but to have a think about some of the kind of the common narratives that we tell about the home and about families in kind of queer and trans communities. So one of those is this kind of narrative about gay people and trans people migrating away from their kind of small towns or the countryside to big cities in order to sort of claim an identity. And I was actually thinking on my way in that it's funny to think about talking about this here because Manchester was that city for me. Actually, I migrated from a kind of semi-rural Surrey and came to Manchester to sort of claim a gay identity. So those narratives are very much present in this section because they do ring true for many of us. But there's also lots of stories that are kind of pushing against that. And one of the things we really tried to do was to show the diversity of people's homes and the different, the ways in which queer and trans people have made homes in rural places and in small towns, how they've stayed put to do that, or they've migrated to those places from cities. So we're really trying to kind of play with that story. And similarly with the family, I think we're often used to this kind of story about people coming out to their families in often fairly kind of traumatic circumstances. There's lots of stories in queer history and trans history about families rejecting their queer and trans family members. And that, again, absolutely has been the experience for some people. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna, can I go forward and go back? Sorry, I'm messing with the thing now. But the other thing that we tried to do with this section is to show that there are actually many different ways of creating queer and trans families, and not all of them involve familial rejection. So I absolutely love this photo on the top there, which is two Mancunian mothers from the Manchester Parents Group who travelled down to London to take part in the Clause 28 march with their banners declaring how they loved their gay children. And so this was taken in 1988, but is just one example of the many groups that were formed in the 70s, 80s, and subsequently that were about kind of supporting families and to support their queer and trans family members. So Parents Inquiry, Friends and Family of Lesbians and Gays, lots of these groups who were doing really important work in advocating for LGBTIQ people. Another couple of examples from that section on the bottom left here, you might recognise the Scottish poet Jackie Kay, who was Scotland's Poet Laureate from 2016 to 2021. She tells an amazing story in her memoir, Red Dust Road, which I highly recommend if you haven't already read it. She talks about her childhood in Glasgow with her adoptive parents, but then she also talks about the birth of her son, Matt, who is in the picture here with her at her installation of Chancellor of the University of Salford in 2015. And on the bottom right here, we've got Freddie McConnell, who talks about the formation of his trans family, and he donated this picture to us, or allowed us to publish it with a little kind of caption to go with it, which says, "This is me, my kids, SJ and LB, and their grandpa, my stepdad, who you can see just kind of loitering in the bushes behind there, taken by their nan and my mum in Spain. Before becoming a dad, if I'd been asked to describe my dream life, it would have been this, picking olives as a family in the hot evening sun." So lots of different examples of what family looks like for queer and trans people. I'm sorry, can we go back again? Thank you. So just picking up on what Matt was saying before about how we were kind of thinking about how to include some of the sort of negative sources in the scrapbook. One of the things I couldn't get away from in my section was this kind of quite a large body of medical literature that was produced in the 50s and 60s that described homosexuals, in the language of the time, as being the product of dysfunctional families. So over and over again, you read this kind of Freudian narrative about how homosexuals are made by parents who have not raised their children properly. And in particular, distant fathers and overbearing or overprotective mothers. And so, I had to include some of that material just to kind of give a flavor of what people were encountering in that period. But then I love this cartoon that by the feminist cartoonist Jo Nesbitt, which was published in the feminist journal Spare Rib in the late 70s, where she's just kind of playing with that narrative and has this kind of picture of a romantic meal between a mother and her infant daughter. And just this caption at the top: causes of lesbianism, disappointed wife transfers affection to daughter. I'm just going to hop back again. One of the other things that I really engage with in this section is some of the kind of different meanings of marriage for LGBTIQ people through this period. So there's some a whole kind of history of people having informal marriage ceremonies or using the language of marriage in the sort of early post-war period, and also of lesbian, gay, and trans people marrying people in order to sort of conform to social expectations. But obviously, we also wanted to cover the introduction of marriage equality. So we had this piece from Peter McGrath, who was one part of the couple who were the first people to get married in the UK in 2013. And he tells this story about how it was really important to him to, as an activist, to be the person who was able to engage with journalists and so on about this moment, and to take it as an opportunity to advocate for lots of other LGBTIQ causes that were really close to his heart. So that's his account of that experience. And then the final section in my part is about homes. And I just wanted to share this source, which was one of my favourites. It's from a project that the West Yorkshire Archive Service did. It was like a digital community history project, again funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. And they asked LGBT residents of West Yorkshire to share a personal story on what they called a memory card. So people wrote in with lots of different memories. But this one is a great little insight into growing up queer in an earlier period. And I'm just going to read it because it's quite hard to. And so this guy says, I grew up in a large 60s built council estate in East Leeds. It was a great place to be as a child, as it was right on the edge of Leeds, with fields only a short walk away. In the mid-70s, when I was 16, I met a boy about a year younger than me. I suppose we were boyfriends, but more in lust than in love. But we wouldn't have dreamt of being able to tell our parents. We kept our relationship hidden, as life wouldn't have been worth living if people knew. But we would take advantage of the countryside on our doorstep to go and spend time together. We would get an illicit thrill holding hands together as we walked through a farmer's field, never giving much thought that anyone in the nearby tower block would be able to see us. And yeah, just like, yeah, have this image of all these people kind of peeking out of their windows at these teenage boys. It's fantastic. Um, okay, just lastly, coming back to that point about the kind of narrative of people migrating from small towns and rural areas to cities to kind of claim a LGBTQ identity. Victoria Golding, who recently completed a PhD, wrote this piece for us on the lesbian community in Todmorden and Hebden Bridge. And it's just a fascinating story. She did a load of kind of oral history interviews and went and took photos and so on. But it's just a great story about women who had moved from many of them from the squats in London, and had used GLC, so Greater London Council funding to acquire skills in trades, and taken those skills and bought rundown houses in Todmorden that were kind of cheap enough that they could afford, and use those skills to do them up. And in the process built a lesbian feminist community in Todmorden, which just really kind of flips on its head that narrative of people kind of moving to the city. Okay, that is my section.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, we wanted to give a flavour of the two remaining sections. So we had sex and socialising, which I think you were going to talk about, Rebecca.
Yes, I've decisively put my notes down.
Kind of.
Yes, so this section was created by Justin Bengry, and yes, explores kind of social spaces and sex. I think we keep calling it sex and socializing rather than socializing and sex, which perhaps says something about our sense of what's important in this section. Yeah, I just wanted to share this one source from Justin's section, which I really like. It's from a 1950s magazine called Films and Filming, which was a kind of just a mainstream magazine about films. But being about films, it included lots of kind of images, still images from films, often including men in kind of various states of undress. And so it kind of gathered this queer readership that was not kind of part of the intention of the publication. And so Justin found kind of evidence of this in oral history interviews and so on, where people were talking about kind of reading films and filming, and took a look at some of the kind of personal ads section that was in the back of this magazine. And if you kind of look carefully, you can see that perhaps some of these people are not really looking for fellow film buffs to be pen pals. So I particularly like this one. Hirsute young man 25 wishes to meet, correspond with similar males. Interests, films, music, theatre, physique. Photo appreciated. So yeah, Justin's section is kind of full of really great sort of putting some of these things kind of side by side to tell a story.
It goes back, doesn't it, to that kind of connection with cinema and film that we started with as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and then EJ's section on activism and community. Just to flag a couple of things. It's a really wonderful section because I think it really stretches and makes us think about what activism actually means and what constitutes an activist. And EJ covers all sorts of the dimensions of that. So if we just flick through, there's stuff on the union movement. Here, it was a meeting of Nalgo in the Isle of Man when it was still illegal in 1983 to have homosexual sex, and so the queer the gay and lesbian subgroup in Nalgo was saying, well, this is kind of ridiculous to be at a conference in a place where actually it's illegal to have gay sex. So that was that controversy. And then and I think a really moving couple of spreads talks about the Pride movement and the way in which it diversified from London. So in the 80s, 90s, very much this sense that Pride was a London event. but the way in which that's kind of moved across the country, especially in the 2000s, and diversified in other ways as well. So the Canal House hosts, I think, the biggest Black Pride globally. And EJ also collected banners from Trans Pride, which also appear in his section as well. Yeah, this is just to clock. Finally, this is the first conference on transvestism and transsexualism, which was held in Leeds in 1974. Yeah, they said in unison. The Gay Liberation Front did the tea and cakes in the breaks, so there's a real sense of allyship in this and at that point. And what was really interesting about this was, you know, the significance of conferences of this type in kind of providing the thinking behind activism and the kind of fuel in a way for and arguments that people could take forward. Okay, so that's kind of just the flavour of EJ's section, and I guess to kind of round up. One of the things, I mean, it's been a real joy to work on this project. And I think what it really made us think about was the kind of collaborative, the particularly collaborative nature of queer history making from the 70s. And if you look at a lot of the kind of scholar activists in the 70s and 80s, they were very often working in the kind of ways that we've enjoyed working together on this project. So yeah, and with MUP, who've just been tremendous partners in producing this book. So yeah, great, good. So if anybody's got any,
sorry.
No, you go.
Yeah, I think we've got half an hour or so for questions or comments or anything that anybody would like to.
Anyone have a question? How long did it take to to gather all the materials for the book? Like, how difficult was that?
When did we start working on this?
Years.
Yeah, it's been a few years in the making, and I think it's difficult to say because actually a lot of the stuff was kind of we'd gathered as we went along, and actually part of the impetus for the book was not knowing what to do with a lot of this material, and so finding a home for it here was really special because you come across these wonderful images and ephemera, but you don't know where to put them. So actually having a scrapbook format was a nice resource for that.
Yeah, I think in some ways the kind of deciding what to leave out was maybe harder than what to put in, wasn't it? Trying to kind of get we were really aiming for geographical coverage as well, weren't we? And so trying to make sure that kind of different places were represented, but also picking up a lot of the themes that we wanted to explore. So but there's obviously there's so much more material that's not in there than is in there, and some of that was also pragmatic because the images just weren't sharp enough. Yeah.
So sometimes that was incredibly helpful. MUP just said, look, we just can't include that one. So sometimes that was a gift, you know. So great.
Oh, yeah.
Kathleen.
Thing you discovered, or what has stayed with you about your research?
I think immediate came to mind was the gay bar in a zoo. And where was it? It was like in Surrey or something that ran for a while in the
Yeah, I can't remember.
I think that was your favourite one you said, Alan.
My favourite.
Yeah.
Tell everyone about that.
Yeah, it was called the Safari Bar. Yeah. I don't know, some most surprising.
I don't know.
I think one of the things that struck me, I mean, we were loosely thinking about this as a scrapbook from the 50s or 60s onwards. But what struck me working on the arts and culture section was actually stretching further back. So the story of Lily and Gemma and the throughpull in Kent, and actually just thinking about the ways in which people managed to forge a life and forge a kind of livable, not just a survivable life, and the kind of ways in which they were able to do that by choosing the people that they socialized with, or choosing the kind of resources they gathered around them, the artistic or creative resources they gathered around them, and the really inventive ways in which they did that. you know, in apparently quite hostile contexts often. And then the other thing I was thinking about was just the wit of some of the material. So I think one of my favourites is the, you know, the Ian Paisley. Homosexuality remained illegal in Northern Ireland until 1982 or 4. And Ian Paisley was a big 82. Was a big 82 was a big you know, trying to prevent partial legalization. So he had this slogan, save Ulster from sodomy. The activists came back, and it appears in here with a banner that says save sodomy from Ulster.
Thanks so much. That was super interesting. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I had a question about, you mentioned the kind of some of the negative or the painful or the violent, you know, text or images that you felt you had to include in the book. Is that also in some of the scrapbooks or people's kind of personal archives that you came across? Are people holding on to, in some cases that gets subverted, like that you said about, you know, are people actually holding on or telling that, you know, is inclusion in the book was maybe and I also wondered, I think you all, well, in your chapters and in what you said today, you talked about yourselves. Was that something all of you like explicitly decided, you know, we're going to do that in this project? Was that something that kind of, you know, organically came together because of the time?
Okay. So the first question, I think perhaps not so much in individual scrapbook, I think, but in some of those kind of more published versions. So so like Transvestia magazine, for example, they published quite a lot of medical literature, and literally the editor, Virginia Prince, annotated them with his kind of arguments back against them. So that's one kind of example of that, of people doing that. But I think perhaps less so actually I suppose if you're kind of doing it for yourself, you perhaps don't want to kind of sit with the more negative stuff.
Although I was thinking about, I worked a lot on the scrapbooks of George Ives. So George Ives was one of the early homosexual law reform campaigners from the 1890s. So he formed a very small, secretive pressure group for law reform, and he compiled this incredible scrapbook over 50 years and runs to many, many volumes. And what's really interesting about that, it just occurred to me that actually there's something similar in there, because he includes fairly religiously, he does newspaper cuttings of men that have been arrested and sent to prison and suicides and so on, and they kind of populate these pages. But what's really interesting is that each page, you know, it also has something, some piece of positive kind of, you know, some kind of positive clipping or a positive extract or something else. So you can kind of see him kind of navigating, I suppose, in the pages of the scrapbook. But I also think that he felt he was quite a serious character, as that's something you get from his diaries. And I think there was also a sense of a kind of almost a duty to record in those scrapbooks. And I think so sometimes these scrapbooks operate as a very personal kind of curation of self. But sometimes I think they do that, and there's a sense of responsibility to record what was happening. And I think Ives, in some way, was recording the kind of pernicious policing and pernicious newspaper coverage in his scrapbook, alongside his love of cricket and various other things. So you kind of see these different parts of his identity. Yeah, and the other thing was around our personal,
perhaps came about organically to a certain extent. I think we had a lot of fun with our scrapbook meetings, and sort of sharing with each other some of the sources that we were including and so on. And I think perhaps we all had a bit of a tendency to say, oh, I saw that, or I read that, and so we ended up kind of weaving our own stories into it, I think, a little bit. Like you mentioned, Maurice, the film being important to you, and that was the first gay book that I ever read. And so there were some of those kinds of things that we sort of felt like we might have to kind of write ourselves in to a certain extent.
And I think in a way that speaks to, I suppose, what I'd see as a a particular characteristic of queer history making, that it's often deeply personal. And I think there's kind of if you read a lot of queer history, and you'll often find historians writing themselves in. What was it that kind of drew them to these particular stories or histories? And often it's because history is providing some sort of anchor point. And so in a way it felt, I mean, I think as Rebecca had, it wasn't a deliberate decision, it was quite organic, but in a way it feels right.
Yeah.
Because obviously what we've amassed here is deeply, it's things that drew us. So it is a personal selection in many ways. So, it would have been slightly dishonest maybe to write ourselves out. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's a totally personal activity to make.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although it was funny because I think when we were putting together the spreads and that photo of me as a 6-year-old, it felt fine when it was just on just on the on a screen, and I had a bit of a shock when I opened the book. It's like, oh my God. I think it's slightly bigger than I thought it was going to be. With my tank top. Yeah.
I was curious to know whether, obviously, the idea of a scrapbook came because of the, I guess, queer tradition. But also, I feel like the book to me feels very accessible to perhaps people who aren't academics. I'm doing my undergraduate dissertation at the moment on homosexual men in London, so ultimately I'm not helping the. But what I found a lot, I'm doing about before the 50s, and there's more than ever, but it's not as well researched as other topics. So was that also that something came into your aim about how the book is presented and how it's told, is that people who might not necessarily be looking for this history might come across it and be interested in it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose again, if we're thinking about queer history making more broadly, I think it's been a strand of history that's been particularly keen to cross boundaries between academic and popular history. So if you think about kind of early queer historical work, which went on outside the academy, because history departments weren't accommodating this stuff, or accommodating historians who were working on queer themes. So this work was often going on outside the academy. And I think it became really important to be producing work that wasn't only going to be read by other historians. So in a way, I suppose there's a sense that we're kind of trying to touch that tradition a bit with this. And in a way, the first book, especially the Queer Beyond London book that I wrote with Alison Oram, there was a similar impulse there. We didn't want that to be a kind of an academic book. We wanted it to be something that kind of spoke more broadly. So that's been one of the kind of impulses of the project as a whole, I think, as well. Yeah.
And I think when we were putting it together, we were sort of imagining that that people would pick up the book and be flicking through and looking for something that they could kind of find a connection with. So we were trying to kind of meet that as much as we could. And I think we probably also I certainly did in my life, had people in our own kind of family and friends who were kind of, my partner's from the Northeast, and she was continually saying, have you got Teesside in there? We need some Teesside in there. So, so I think there was a bit of that too.
There was that slight panic sometimes. It's like, we've got nothing on Nottingham.
I've got a question. So each time you've made a book, it's made you want to do something else. And so I'm wondering where your thoughts are.
Well, you've had 2 books come out in the same month, so you should answer that one first.
So actually, alongside this, I was working on a book called Writing Queer History, which was really interesting which is kind of about the genesis of queer history as a subdiscipline, and where it came from and its key kind of characteristics and features. And so it was really interesting working on this alongside, because it really made me think about the kind of processes of both kind of curating an archive, but also making historical narrative out of it. So that book came out a couple of weeks ago alongside this. So it's been really interesting working on them alongside each other. But actually, I'm moving on to a project on working lives and a kind of intersections of queer and labour history, because one of the things that kind of I really started to notice is whenever, for example, you get an account of a prosecution in the press, it always says, Joe Smith, shop worker, or Joe Smith, who worked in so-and-so factory. So the way in which a kind of labouring or work identity kind of crosses over or inflects a kind of way of being queer in the world. So yeah, so that's where I'm going there.
And I am working on a project on which I suppose does partly come out of this. I suppose one of the things about this project, and Matt was talking at the end there about the 1974 conference on transsexualism and how the GLF did the catering, and I think that issue, I think for me particularly as a lesbian historian, that has really been confronting in my field in the last kind of 5-10 years, is this kind of media narrative that's pitting kind of trans history against lesbian history, and which is just so incredibly upsetting for so many reasons. So the project that I'm working on is thinking about kind of going back to my first book was on the sort of 40s and 50s and 60s. So going back to that period that I kind of feel particularly comfortable in, and thinking about how ideas about gender nonconformity and sexual nonconformity are sort of tied up in each other. So so there's all these stories about people who were assigned female at birth, who are presenting in a masculine way, who if we're using the categories that we have now, we might want to claim them as lesbian or we might want to claim them as trans, but actually neither of those categories are being used in that period, and how people instead were thinking about what that meant for them. So yeah.
Right, sounds exciting.
I'm really with the idea of a scrapbook, the idea that scraps that are important, one person, really personal, sometimes whimsical, sometimes voyeuristic, kind of almost. And that first example you had of the Japanese aviation, kind of just personal to that person. So as historians, what was different about putting together a scrapbook for you? Was it different?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, I've never worked on a project like this.
No.
In some ways it was really freeing. I think as historians, we're generally trying to kind of construct a narrative. So you want things to kind of somehow tie together into some coherent, story that you can tell. And although, you've always got that voice in the back of your head from your training that you shouldn't ignore the stuff that doesn't, support your argument, in some ways you do kind of, foreground the stuff that is what you want to say. And I think the great thing about doing a scrapbook is that you can put all these contradictory things in there together, and you don't have to make them make sense with each other. You can just say, oh, actually, this person was thinking this, and at exactly the same time somewhere else somebody was thinking something completely different, and how do we make sense of those? And we don't have to make sense of them. So so yeah, that's really freeing.
Yeah, we didn't have to weave a narrative about it. But there's also a sense of sharing the joy, because one of the great things about being a historian is being in the archive and actually delving through this stuff, which then doesn't make it into the books we write. So this was a real joy, actually being able to actually put some of the sorts of materials that we're working with. But it was also challenging because, I think one of the things we had to do was write captions of 20 words. I never write only 20 words. So how do you like label this bit of this photograph that I might otherwise be writing a page about? So it was also it was a really interesting exercise in kind of working or writing differently as well. It was really fun, and really what was really nice is, I mean, we've kind of talked about working on these different sections, but there was some quite fun horse trading as well, I think. Right up to the last minute, I think things were moving. I'll give you Save Ulster from sodomy if you give me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the images as well for me was like, one of the one of the things I loved about the project, but also a steep learning curve that, you know, I'm not used to working with images because there are so few pictures of, and actually still in the home and family section, one of the biggest challenges was trying to find photographs of gay or trans parents and their children, because even when photos have been taken, often they explicitly said, I do not give permission for this image to be reproduced because it's got children in it. And so trying to find, and I think the same thing was true for Justin in the socializing section, that we forget now that we have kind of mobile phones with cameras, that, you know, there was a time when people didn't take cameras into, you know, gay nightclubs. And so there's not as much as you would hope for that.
But by the same time, I think what's one of the really lovely things about this is I think there's a particular significance to the visual in queer cultures, because actually just seeing other people, you know, I mean, it's why film has been so important, and why the kind of embodiment of theatre and why photography and art has been so important, because visualizing difference becomes, it's been really key. And so what has been really nice as a historian is not just writing that down, but actually putting the visual on the page has been lovely. Yeah. Great. Yeah, you're allowed.
Thing. And I can imagine going back to Justin's chapter, right? So sex and socializing, but I think socializing and sex on the page, right? Presumably there must have been quite a lot of, you know, sexual material, erotica, pornography, whatever, however we classify it. And then obviously, presumably, we'll have to buy the book and find out. To make some decisions, I guess, about what is included. Or was it actually not so prominent, that kind of thing, whether it's visual or textual?
I think there is some slightly
Saucy
stuff in there.
Page 33.
Yeah, I don't know how much he filtered out before.
No. Yeah, before we saw what he'd pulled together. Yeah. But it's interesting. Something. No.
About how, I mean, you just mentioned there that there was almost gaps in laws for certain topics, or like not able to use photographs. Did you notice, either of you in the research, that there was any prominent gaps and things that you wanted to include, or you wanted to find research for, areas, for example, themes that you were like, oh, I wonder about this, but then couldn't really find the material gaps that maybe there is a lack of archival material.
Well, I think one of the things that we found was that we were kind of looking to represent sort of categories that we work with now, but which actually weren't necessarily being used that much in like some part of the period. So one of the things that we had a bit of a panic kind of halfway through, didn't we, where we thought, oh no, we don't have any kind of representation of, or we did have some, but less representation of bisexuality. And but then when we thought about it, we thought actually it's practically on every page. It's just that people aren't using that term, like they're kind of so one example is in my section. I've got some stuff from the 1960s lesbian magazine Arena 3. And a really significant proportion of the women who were writing in and receiving that magazine were married, and so lots of letters on the letters pages are about that, but they don't call themselves bisexual. They call themselves usually married lesbians, but often, you know, their relationships with their husbands are, you know, loving relationships and sexual relationships, but they just didn't choose to use that term in the context of a lesbian magazine in the 60s. And I think so, yeah, I think some of that kind of what at some points we thought was lack of coverage was actually just that the way that people were thinking about things was not how we think about them now.
And the identity categories that just happen to be prominent. So I think the interesting thing about gay and lesbian gets used very distinctly to describe an identity, but often bisexuality is more about what you have done or what you do. So, you know, a lot of the people that appear in the scrapbook have had relationships with men and with women, but that's what they have done rather than how they describe themselves or think about their identity. So there's a kind of interesting sense in which certain identities, I think, float to the surface more than others, in really interesting ways, I think, because that's partly about also how we think about gender and so on. So.
Did your themes come out of the crowdsourcing? And what didn't make the cut?
Oh, how did we come up with the theme?
Yeah, I don't know. At this point, it feels like they were always there, but I suppose there was a point when we.
I think there was a point when we were going to be much more eclectic, and then actually, I think just almost pragmatically, how are we going to organize ourselves to do this? And I think that was the point at which we thought, okay, maybe we need to thematize, because one of the things we wanted to do initially and didn't end up being able to do was to think about what was cross-cutting between the sections, because actually we've got these 4 sections, but actually they really speak to each other. So, you know, for example, I mean, just the example that came up earlier, you know, film is very important in my section, but then it's really important in Justin's section on sex and socializing and sex. And we were going to have a bit at the start, weren't we, where we thought about those connections and kind of but we didn't in the end. So, but I think maybe they kind of floated to the surface a bit. I mean, the whole process has maybe been more organic and less deliberate. And I'm trying to make that sound positive. I don't know. We didn't really have a plan somehow.
The magazines that were doing this kind of scrapbooking, so the Urania thing, that, and I realise I might be asking you to speculate here, but why were they doing it? Was it a kind of creating visibility? Was it resistance when people were sending things in? Is there any idea of this sort of motivation for that? Fascinating.
Yeah. I always think of it as like being part of a conversation. I don't know whether that's true, but like to me, I always imagine people kind of, you know, sat in their living rooms, read. I mean, this is the other thing that like, you know, so many of these, probably not Urania, but some of those kind of 1960s ones were sent out in plain cover, as they like to call it. And you sort of imagine these things landing on the doorstep and people kind of hiding them away until they've got a moment when they can open them and read them. And I think, you know, you can tell from the letters that people are writing in that it was a major event in their kind of, you know, in their year, because often these came out kind of every couple of months or something, that they would look forward to it and it would be this kind of special moment where they felt like they were part of something. And so I've always imagined them in those periods in between, when they find something that they think has meaning to the other people, they cut it out, they put it away, and and they're sort of sharing that as part of that conversation.
It's almost like kind of a bit of community building through the scrapbook.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I often think about. I think there's also that sense, and you get this. I don't know if you have seen images of Joe Orton and Ken Halliwell's bedsit and the wall, which is kind of a collage of all sorts of kind of different kind of cultural icons and images and cutouts from books and Shakespeare and classical images and so on. And I think there's that sense of like when you're trying to forge a sense of self and like what can we pick, you know, that's around us already that we can configure in a different way that makes that speaks of a difference within a culture rather than necessarily being outside of that. Well, it's impossible to be outside of the culture. So what are the resources within a kind of cultural context that we can kind of draw on? And I think that's kind of what's happening in a lot of scrapbooking and the excitement of actually kind of being a bit irreverent, you know, with what's around. There's a wonderful piece by Neil Bartlett, the theatre maker and writer, where he talks about queer people scrabbling around in the gutter and in bins, just to kind of a kind of bricolage of bits and bobs that kind of make up a sense of difference from what's already there. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you guys, that's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.